And God said unto Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 and 14, and he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge. And afterwards shall they come out with a great substance. 400 years since 1619 plus 400 equals 2019. A 400-year sentence. The expiration of the curse.
Welcome to church, West Side! Yeah, the redemption is the mission. 400 years of sentence, that curse hit expiration. Luster showed to steal, but his deception had no fire. Wow! The diaspora! We the voices on the street now. Reverend point blank! This is the victory to beat now. Take it to now's the accepted time you feel the spirit moving. Peace and love everywhere. Yeah! Peace and love everywhere.
Thank you and welcome to the Take It to the Nine podcast. I am the Reverend Point Blank, standing at the edge of time, where silence once blessed is now a flagrant crime. They did not just trade our lives for gold. They wrapped fake faith around shackles cold in churches of Angola right by the sea. They baptized chains in the name of the free, and empires rose with words like grace, while pulpits stood silence, leaving no trace. But I call it out now, no nonsense here. The church must face what it did. Not every voice was silent. Some fought, some rose. But the truth is a fire that never slows. So now we speak with the faith in our eyes, as we vow that this truth will surely survive and rise. 400 years in a land not our own. The seeds of the kingdom were buried, not sown. They traded our names for a brand and chains, and built up empires on top of our pain. They painted the Savior to look like the foe, to keep us from seeking the truth that we all know. But the clock of the prophets has struck the last chime. The nine has arrived at the end of that time, from the banks of the Nile to the West African coast. God hid his treasures from Pharaoh's proud host. The DNA carried the covenant's mark, a flame that they could never quench in the dark. The byword is breaking. The lies are exposed. The doors of the prison are finally enclosed. We aren't just people of struggle and scars. We are the dust of the earth and the light of the stars. The yoke has been shattered. The lion is awake. The foundations of Egypt are starting to shake. No longer a victim, no longer a slave. We rise from identity they tried to grave, with the sword of the Spirit and the truth of our shield. The harvest is ready, and we are taking the entire field. From the diaspora's voice to my own mic, the spark of the Spirit is now ready to strike. We are Israel. We are the seed of the free. Don't sit down, stand up, and then you will see. Peace and love, and enjoy your time. Mike and Nika, break it down, and please take out the rhymes.
So what if the transatlantic slave trade wasn't just, a brutal historical tragedy driven by human greed?
Right, like what if it was actually the exact pinpoint fulfillment of a 3,000-year-old biblical prophecy?
And building on that, what happens to our understanding of modern global geopolitics if a literal 400-year divine sentence on a specific group of people has just, reached its expiration date?
That is the staggering premise we are unpacking today.
Yeah, welcome to this deep dive into the source material. I mean, our mission today is to navigate this highly detailed, deeply provocative theological and sociological manifesto.
It's titled The 400-Year Sentence, The Expiration of the Curse, written by a man who goes by the Reverend Point Blank.
And let me tell you, it is a massive, incredibly dense text.
Oh, absolutely. We are talking about an argument that attempts to completely rewrite thousands of years of human history, theology, and sociology, all into one single unified narrative.
But before we jump into the deep end here, I mean, we really need to set some clear ground rules for today's dive.
Definitely. That framing is essential.
Because this text, it steps on a lot of theological, historical, and political third rails. It deals with race, institutional power, highly specific religious interpretations.
Right.
So our job today isn't to tell you if Reverend Point Blank is right or wrong. We aren't here to endorse this theology or validate his historical interpretations.
Exactly. We are entirely impartial guides here.
Right. Our job is just to put on a scuba suit, dive into his exact arguments, and show you how he builds this incredibly complex case from the ground up.
We just want you to understand the architecture of the argument he's making.
Yeah. So to understand that architecture, we first have to understand the architect. Who is Reverend Point Blank?
Well, he presents himself as a pastor, originally hailing from the west side of Chicago. He frequently refers to his hometown as the Chi.
Oh, okay, got it.
And he makes a real point of emphasizing that while he grew up in the hood, he never allowed his intellect to be boxed in by that environment.
Yeah, he merges that street-level survival training, what he calls the grind and the hustle, with some serious formal theological study.
He did here. He spent 4 years at a seminary in Texas, pastored a church down there, and then spent years traveling.
I think the text said he traveled to 66 different countries.
Yep, 66 countries.
Yeah.
Immersing himself in various global religions. He also spent time in Los Angeles, which is an industry town he critically refers to as Follywood.
Bollywood, that tells you a lot about his perspective right there.
It really does. And what is fascinating from a rhetorical standpoint is how this varied lived experience merges into a very specific voice.
I noticed that too. He transitions so seamlessly between discussing urban decay and then ancient Hebrew etymology and then global geopolitical shifts.
Right. And he argues that if you look closely, all major world religions share the same underlying ancient principles.
But over time, the names and faces have been deliberately changed, as he says, to protect the guilty.
Which brings us to the absolute core thesis of his work.
Okay, let's hear it.
Point Blank posits that Satan-like, the actual spiritual entity, hates black people not because of the amount of melanin in their skin.
Wait, not because of melanin?
No. In fact, he explicitly argues that spiritual entities do not care about melanin at all. He claims the hatred is entirely based on a covenant DNA.
A covenant DNA. Okay, that's a huge shift in perspective.
It is the pivotal concept you have to keep in mind for this entire discussion. The text frames the modern struggle for civil rights not as a sociological issue of race, but as an ancient spiritual blood feud.
Oh, wow. So the claim is that black people of the diaspora are the literal biological descendants of the biblical Israelites.
Exactly. He calls them the slumbering giant of biblical prophecy.
And he asserts that an ancient curse that kept this giant asleep has just expired.
Yes. But to buy into this massive prophetic timeline, Point Blank says we first have to recognize what he considers the greatest cover-up in human history.
Right. He asks you, the listener, to look at the history of the world and observe the highly specific, relentless nature of anti-black hatred globally.
Whether you look at the United States, Brazil, or the African continent itself, he points to a synchronized global system designed to keep this specific demographic at the absolute bottom.
And he introduces this concept, I think he calls it the empty vault principle.
He does. And he asks a highly logical question here. If black people are truly as inherently inferior, intellectually deficient, or valueless as centuries of colonial history has claimed,
right,
then why has the global power structure spent trillions of dollars to police, contain, miseducate, and systematically destroy them?
That is a really striking way to frame the origin.
I actually want to read a specific quote from the text that perfectly captures his logic here.
Go for it.
The author writes, "You do not build a billion-dollar fortress to guard an empty vault. You do not station an army to watch over a graveyard. You only guard what is highly valuable. You only attack what you deeply fear."
The intensity of the attack is the proof of the value.
Exactly.
I was thinking about this concept, and it honestly reminds me of a hostile corporate takeover.
How so?
Well, imagine a massive, ruthless conglomerate buys out a smaller, family-owned company. The very first thing the new hostile board of directors does is go down to the corporate archives and systematically shred every founding document.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, they burn the original stock certificates, they delete the emails. So the heirs of those original founders never wake up one day, look at the paperwork, and realize they actually own the billion-dollar building the new board is currently sitting in.
That analogy maps perfectly onto Point Blank's concept of what he calls the gatekeepers.
The gatekeeper, okay.
He argues that global institutions have operated exactly like that hostile board of directors, spending centuries guarding the secret of Black biblical identity.
So let's look at who he actually identifies as these gatekeepers. He starts with religion, right?
Yes, the author points a finger directly at what he terms slaveholder Christianity.
Right. The text argues that Western religious institutions are complicit actors at the very top of the hierarchy.
It claims they deliberately taught a theology of pacification. They presented a God who supposedly sanctioned chattel slavery,
A God who demanded that the oppressed turn the other cheek to physical violence.
and who promised a metaphorical mansion in the sky after death, while the oppressor literally built physical mansions on earth using their extracted free labor.
But he goes much deeper into the visual psychology of this too. He zeroes in on the Renaissance.
He does. He asks why, during a time of immense global exploration and the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade, European powers and the church spent millions of dollars hiring the greatest artists of the era.
Right. Names like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci.
Exactly. Hiring them to paint a distinctly European savior.
And the author asserts this wasn't just, artistic license. It was a calculated psychological investment.
The text argues this was the ultimate form of spiritual warfare.
Because if you condition an enslaved people to bow down to a deity that looks exactly like the men holding the whips, they will subconsciously worship their oppressor.
Yes. They will begin to inherently associate divinity, purity, and goodness with European features.
And tragically, associate depravity and sin with their own image.
It's a devastating critique of how religious iconography shapes human psychology.
It really is. But Point Blank doesn't stop at the church doors. He moves right along to the academic gatekeepers.
Right, the academic institutions, the universities, and specifically the textbook publishers.
The author claims these entities act as weapons of mass deception.
By systematically erasing the connections between Africa and ancient Hebrew civilization from world history curriculums.
He talks about how textbooks universally teach that modern civilization, philosophy, and mathematics started in Greece and Rome.
But he says they intentionally omit the historical fact that ancient Greek philosophers themselves admitted they learned their foundational knowledge by studying under the Ethiopians and Egyptians.
Wow. And the text also points out how historical cartography has been manipulated, right?
Yes. Ancient maps that explicitly label parts of Africa as the land of the Hebrews are hidden away in archives.
And the broader context of archaeology, like the fact that the oldest human remains are consistently found in Africa, is stripped of its spiritual significance.
The goal, according to the source, is to rewrite the baseline narrative of human history so completely that the oppressed believe they literally came from nothing.
Thereby ensuring they believe they're destined to achieve nothing.
Exactly. And then we get to the political and economic gatekeepers.
Right. The text argues that modern Western governments, which built their foundational wealth on the extracted labor of enslaved Africans, have a vested existential interest in keeping this truth hidden.
This is where Point Blank connects ancient biblical prophecy to modern geopolitical debates, specifically the ongoing debate around reparations.
Because he argues that governments fiercely fight the concept of reparations, not simply because of the astronomical financial costs.
No, he claims it is much deeper and more terrifying than money.
Right, because if a government formally admits the crime of the transatlantic slave trade to the degree of literally paying reparations, they have to formally admit who the specific victims are.
And if they admit those victims are the biblical Israelites, they inadvertently validate the ancient prophecy.
And if they validate the prophecy, they are forced to admit that the God who authored that prophecy is real.
And that the divine judgment promised in those same ancient texts against the oppressing nations is imminent.
The text suggests that acknowledging this truth wouldn't just bankrupt a nation, it would cause the entire geopolitical structure of the world to spiritually and structurally collapse.
Finally, the text identifies the entertainment gatekeepers.
The author claims that God gave Black people a specific divine gift of influence, rhythm, creativity, and culture designed to attract the nations of the world to him.
But the enemy stole this gift, monetized it through the entertainment industry, and perverted it.
The argument is that the modern entertainment complex deliberately incentivizes the glorification of trauma and violence over virtue.
It elevates athletes and entertainers, turning them into modern-day idols, while simultaneously ignoring, defunding, or suppressing Black scholars, intellectuals, and prophets.
I think the text summarizes this dynamic by saying The gatekeepers want black people dancing for dollars, but not prophesying deliverance.
Yes, that's the exact quote.
But wait, this is where the logistics get kind of murky for me, and I have to push back a little.
Okay, what's the hang-up?
Point Blank is claiming a synchronized global conspiracy. We are talking about the Vatican, academic textbook publishers, the global banking system, and Hollywood executives all supposedly sitting in a room together for 400 years, agreeing to keep this specific secret.
Right.
How does the text explain the sheer logistical coordination of a conspiracy that massive? Because, let's be real, human beings can't even keep a secret in a 5-person office for a week.
That is a highly critical observation, and the text actually anticipates that exact skepticism.
Oh, it does.
Yes, the author is very explicit that this is not a human conspiracy in the way we usually think of one.
Yeah.
You do not have politicians and studio executives sitting in a smoke-filled room reading ancient Hebrew scrolls and plotting.
So then how does the coordination actually happen?
The text frames it entirely through a supernatural lens. The coordination is demonic.
Okay, unpacking that a bit.
The author quotes the biblical book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world.
I see.
The text posits that there is a single spiritual puppeteer, Satan, who possesses an ancient, uninterrupted memory. He remembers the original covenant made in the Garden of Eden.
So the human institutions, those gatekeepers we just discussed, are viewed merely as unwitting puppets manipulated by this unseen spiritual force.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, so the human beings, the politicians, the popes, the CEOs, they are just the hardware. But the demonic principality is the software running the actual program of suppression across centuries.
That is exactly the mechanism he describes. And because spiritual entities do not die of old age, the strategy remains perfectly consistent across generations.
Whether that software is running on the hardware of Pharaoh in ancient Egypt, King Herod in Judea, or a modern corporate lobbyist for the prison industrial complex.
Precisely.
Okay, well, if the global hardware was programmed to erase the truth, where does Point Blank find the receipts to prove it?
He goes straight to the one text they couldn't fully erase, the Bible itself.
To understand the author's argument about identity, we have to look at how he completely remaps biblical geography.
He does. He asks you, the listener, to close your eyes and picture the Bible lands.
And most people, conditioned by centuries of Western media, picture a Middle East that looks like modern-day Israel sandy desert landscapes populated by people with light-skinned European features.
But the text argues that image is a carefully constructed deception. The author asserts that human civilization, and specifically biblical civilization, did not start in Europe or the modern conception of the Middle East.
It started in Africa.
Yes. He directs the reader straight to Genesis chapter 2, which describes the geographical location of the Garden of Eden.
The scripture explicitly states that a river went out of Eden and parted into 4 heads.
The first river, Kishon, encompasses the land of Havilah. The second river, Gihon, encompasses the whole land of Ethiopia. And Point Blank emphasizes this forcefully. Ethiopia. Africa.
He points out that the rivers defining the borders of Eden literally flow through the African continent.
And that ancient maps and geographers routinely confirmed the Bible lands were essentially an extension of African lands.
Building on this geographical foundation, the text examines the creation of humanity itself.
The author breaks down the ancient Hebrew word for Adam, right?
He does. He notes it is pronounced Adam and explains that it directly translates to red earth or ruddy.
And he asks a simple question. What color is rich, fertile, life-giving soil?
It's dark brown. It's black.
Therefore, if God formed the first man from the dust of this specific African ground, the first man was a black man.
And he applies this exact same logic to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, arguing they were dark-skinned people living in Africa and the ancient Middle East.
This leads to one of the most fascinating scriptural reinterpretations in the entire manifesto regarding the life of Moses.
Right, because Moses was born in Egypt, which is geographically in Africa.
And according to the biblical narrative, he was raised in Pharaoh's own household, passing as Pharaoh's actual grandson for decades.
The logical deduction the text makes here is profound in its simplicity. If Moses was successfully passing as Egyptian royalty, he must have looked exactly like the Egyptians.
He would have had the same skin tone, the same hair texture, the same features.
The author states plainly, you cannot hide a white baby in a black palace. It simply does not work.
That's a powerful point. And then the text brings up the controversy over Moses' marriage.
Yes. Later in life, Moses marries a woman named Zipporah, who the text identifies as a black Ethiopian woman from Midian.
This sparks a major conflict in the book of Numbers, chapter 12. Moses' own sister, Miriam, and his brother, Aaron, criticize Moses specifically for marrying an Ethiopian woman.
And what happens next is framed by the author as the Bible totally flipping the script on modern racial hierarchies.
God gets angry at Miriam for her prejudice against this Ethiopian woman. And how does God punish Miriam?
God strikes Miriam with leprosy.
But the text focuses intensely on the specific physical description of that leprosy provided in the scripture, right?
Yes, her skin turned white as snow.
Point blank emphasizes this heavily. White skin was utilized as a literal punishment, as a divine curse for a racist attitude against a black woman.
Miriam was humiliated and forced to stand outside the camp for 7 days.
The text uses this narrative to argue definitively that the biblical Hebrews were not white Europeans.
Because if they already had white skin, the punishment of turning her skin white would make absolutely no sense.
It's a really compelling reading of that text. To solidify this argument regarding physical appearance, the author marshals a series of quotes from the ancient prophets.
He quotes Jeremiah 8.21, where the prophet says, "I am black, I am in mourning."
He points to the Song of Solomon 1.56, where the bride declares, "I am black but comely. Look not upon me, because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me."
He also points to the book of Lamentations, chapter 5, which describes the intense suffering of the Israelites by saying, "Our skin was black like an oven."
And Lamentations 4 saying their visage is blacker than a coal.
The author insists these are not poetic metaphors for sadness. He argues these are literal, consistent physical descriptions of the people.
And this entire visual argument culminates in the New Testament with the description of the glorified Christ in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verses 14 and 15.
The text reads, "His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace."
The author breaks down the sensory details of that verse. Hair like wool describes a distinctly kinky, tightly coiled texture.
And feet like fine brass that has been burned in a furnace, that is dark brown, almost black.
The text contrasts this fiercely with the pale, blue-eyed, straight-haired images commissioned during the Renaissance by the gatekeepers.
So if we follow the logic of the source material, and the ancient Israelites were a dark-skinned African-dwelling people, the text must explain how their direct descendants ended up on the auction blocks of the Americas.
Right. That requires a historical bridge, which the author identifies as the 70 AD migration.
Let's look at the history. In 70 AD, the Roman army lays siege to and utterly destroys the city of Jerusalem.
Millions of Hebrew people have to flee for their lives.
The text applies simple, undeniable geographical logic here. If a massive invading Roman army is coming at you from the north and the east, which direction do you run?
You don't run north toward the swords, you run south. You run deep into the African continent.
Exactly. The historical record shows they migrated down through Egypt, through the region of Cush, which is modern-day Sudan, and deep into West Africa.
Where they eventually settled among the native African populations.
And the text uses this incredible visual metaphor to describe this assimilation. It says, God hid his people in the womb of Africa like hiding a black diamond in a pile of coal.
We need to pause and define some terms the author uses here to make this metaphor work.
Right. He distinguishes between Semitic Africans and Hamitic Africans.
In biblical genealogy, Semitic peoples are descendants of Shem. This includes the Hebrews.
And Hamitic peoples are descendants of Ham, which the text associates with the native indigenous African tribes.
Point Blank argues that to the untrained eye of a Roman soldier or a later European explorer, a Semitic African Hebrew and a Hamitic indigenous African looked virtually identical.
I provided the perfect camouflage. For nearly 2,000 years, these Hebrew people lived in West Africa, hidden in plain sight.
But wait, this brings up a massive logical hurdle for me again.
Okay, lay it out.
If they lived in West Africa, completely camouflaged among other tribes for 2 millennia, how did they end up chained in the hulls of European slave ships?
That is the million-dollar question.
Are we supposed to believe that 16th century Portuguese and British sailors just showed up on the coast of Africa, grabbed people at random, and somehow accidentally kidnapped the descendants of the biblical Israelites?
The text is emphatic that this was not random chance, and it certainly wasn't an accident. The author argues that between 1500 and 1800 AD, European slave traders specifically targeted certain tribes.
Wait, they weren't just trading for whoever was captured in local tribal wars.
According to Point Blank's historical interpretation, no. They actively targeted tribes like the Igbo of Nigeria, the Ashanti of Ghana, the Yoruba, and the Akan.
But why those specific tribes?
Because even after 2,000 years of migration, these specific groups retained ancient, undeniable Hebrew customs.
Like what?
Well, they still practiced male circumcision exactly on the 8th day. They observed a strict Sabbath day of rest. They maintained dietary laws that closely resembled kosher restrictions.
Oh, wow.
And crucially, they maintained a monotheistic belief system, a belief in one supreme God, in regions where animism was much more common.
Hold on. For listeners who might not be familiar with the term, what is animism in this context?
Animism is the belief that objects, places, and creatures all possess a distinct spiritual essence. It often involves the worship of various nature spirits or ancestors.
So a tribe practicing strict monotheism in that region would definitely stand out culturally.
It would. So the text is saying the spiritual puppeteer, Satan, used the European colonial nations as a targeted weapon.
The demonic software knew exactly who these specific tribes were, even if the tribes themselves had lost their written Hebrew scrolls and perhaps forgotten their full ancient covenant identity.
Precisely the argument. And this targeted capture was not just a historical tragedy driven by economics. The text argues it was the precise legal initiation of a highly specific biblical curse.
Which brings us to the absolute centerpiece of the author's manifesto, Deuteronomy chapter 28, and what he calls the forensic blueprint of slavery.
If there is a fulcrum on which this entire 400-year thesis rests, it is Deuteronomy 28.
In biblical context, this chapter is a definitive ancient checklist. God lays out the blessings for obedience to the covenant in the first half of the chapter, and a terrifying list of curses for breaking the covenant in the second half.
And Point Blank's claim here is radically audacious. He argues that the specific curses listed in Deuteronomy 28 map perfectly, precisely, and exclusively to the transatlantic slave trade.
And the subsequent ongoing experience of Black people in the diaspora.
He essentially treats the scripture like a forensic file used by a detective to identify a body 2,000 years after the crime was committed.
Let's walk through the evidence the text presents, starting with what the author calls the most important verse in this entire discussion, verse 68.
The verse reads, "And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you."
The author breaks this down surgically. First, the word Egypt.
He notes that in the original Hebrew, the word is Mizraim, which translates literally to house of bondage or place of oppression.
So God is telling the Israelites they will return to a state of horrific slavery.
But the crucial identifying detail is the method of transport, with ships.
Right. The text points out the complete geographical absurdity of needing a fleet of ships to travel from ancient Israel back to literal Egypt.
It is a land journey.
Yeah.
The Israelites literally walked it during the Exodus narrative. You don't need a navy to get to Cairo from Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Therefore, Point Blank concludes, Egypt here is highly symbolic. It represents a new house of bondage, a new geographical location of oppression that specifically requires ships to reach.
And he asks the listener, what singular event in human history involved millions of a specific people group being transported across an ocean on ships into permanent chattel slavery?
The Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade.
The text argues this is a direct, undeniable, prophetic bullseye.
The verse continues, saying they will be sold to their enemies for bondmen and bondwomen.
The text points to the literal auction blocks in places like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans, where human beings were inspected, priced, and sold like cattle.
And then there is the chilling final phrase of verse 68, and no man shall buy you.
The author provides a vital linguistic clarification here that completely changes the meaning. In 17th century King James English, the word buy in this specific context does not mean to purchase at a market.
It means to redeem or save.
So the ancient prophecy is essentially saying, you will go into a captivity so severe, so deeply entrenched structurally and spiritually, that no human hand will be able to save you from it.
Exactly. Point Blank argues that this is why, even after the legal end of slavery, despite the Emancipation Proclamation, despite the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, despite United Nations resolutions,
this systemic oppression merely shapeshifted.
it continued through Jim Crow laws, redlining, and mass incarceration.
The argument is that no human legislation could fully break a divine curse. Only God himself, upon the exact expiration of the sentence, could lift it.
The text then moves to verse 48, which states, "Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in want of all things, and he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee."
The author stresses that this is not a metaphor. He challenges the listener to go to the slave museums in Cape Coast, Ghana, or the Smithsonian Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., and look at the physical evidence on display.
You will see literal iron collars, iron chains, and heavy shackles that were permanently bolted onto the necks of enslaved Africans.
It is a literal physical fulfillment of the text.
Then there's verse 37, "And thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations whither the Lord shall lead thee."
We need to define byword. A byword is a term used to degrade, dehumanize, and summarize an entire group of people with extreme contempt.
The author draws a direct, unflinching line from the biblical term byword to the global use of the N-word.
He argues it is the most widely utilized, universally understood racial slur in human history.
Fulfilling the specific prophecy that they would become a byword among all nations.
The text also points to the profound, agonizing familial destruction prophesied in verse 32. "Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand."
The psychological terror of that verse is staggering. Point blank asks who this describes historically.
It perfectly describes the ancestors standing on the shores of West Africa, watching their children dragged onto the lower decks of ships.
It describes parents standing at the auction block in Virginia, watching their children sold to a plantation in Mississippi, knowing they will never see them again.
But the author also brings the application of this verse directly into the present day. He focuses on the phrase, "no might in thine hand," this state of complete systemic powerlessness.
He applies this to modern parents standing in family courts watching the foster system take their children.
Or standing at a cemetery, burying a son lost to systemic violence or police action, feeling entirely powerless to stop the vast machinery of the system.
I have to pause and just point out how radically audacious this entire framework is.
It really is.
The author is essentially standing in front of the listener and saying, do not look to modern sociology textbooks to explain the Black experience in the Americas. Do not look to Marxist economic theories or critical race theory. Look at this 3,000-year-old scriptural forensic blueprint.
It demands a complete epistemic shift from the reader. It takes raw historical trauma and elevates it to the level of biblical theology.
If you're listening to this on your commute right now, just imagine being the target audience reading this text.
Imagine reading a document written millennia ago and feeling a chilling, spine-tingling recognition that it is describing your family's exact historical trauma, point for point, shackle for shackle.
And that profound sense of recognition is precisely what the author is trying to evoke. But the text doesn't stop at historical analysis.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, so Deuteronomy 28 provides the author's explanation for the historical transatlantic slave trade. But a skeptic would say, slavery ended legally in 1865. If the curse was just about literal chains and auction blocks, why does the author argue the oppression continues so fiercely today?
That's where he introduces a fascinating pivot from historical theology to modern spiritual warfare.
Right. Because Point Blank argues that the curse didn't just evaporate with emancipation. The spiritual warfare continued by embedding itself into new institutional systems.
He categorizes modern systemic racism and institutional failure not as the result of bad bureaucratic policy or inherent sociological flaws, but as active, ongoing assignments executed by 5 specific demonic principalities.
This is where the text brilliantly bridges the gap between gritty urban sociology and Pentecostal spiritual warfare. Let's break down the mechanics of how these spirits actually operate in reality.
Let's start with the spirit of Pharaoh.
Okay.
The spirit of Pharaoh is characterized as the spirit of relentless oppression, physical slavery, and ultimate control. Pharaoh's ancient goal in the book of Exodus was to keep the Israelites in physical bondage because his entire national economy relied on their free brick-making labor.
Point Blank argues that this exact same ancient spirit operates today, just with a new title. It operates through the prison industrial complex.
He points specifically to the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which famously abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime.
He calls that exception clause a loophole big enough to drive 400 years of free labor through it.
The text argues that mass incarceration, fueled by private prison corporations that literally profit from keeping bodies in cells, is simply Pharaoh's brick-making system updated for the 21st century.
The spiritual assignment is to keep Black men specifically in a continuous state of legal constitutional bondage.
The second principality he identifies is the spirit of Jezebel.
In biblical texts, Jezebel is often associated with manipulation, usurpation of authority, and the destruction of divine order.
The author applies this spirit directly to the destruction of the family structure. He cites the sociological statistic that over 70% of Black children in America are raised in single-parent homes.
The text argues this is not natural, and it is not just a moral or sociological failing of the community. It is a highly coordinated spiritual attack designed to remove Black men and fathers from the home.
And he details how this spirit uses other systems to accomplish this, through disproportionate incarceration rates, systemic violence, or overwhelming economic pressure that breaks marriages apart.
The logic here is that the family is the foundational building block of any community.
If you destroy the family by removing the father, you break the community's covering, its discipline, and its direction, leaving the next generation incredibly vulnerable to the other spirits.
The third principality is the spirit of poverty. This is described as a generational curse of perpetual wealth extraction.
Point Blank notes the phenomenon of people working incredibly hard, 2 or 3 jobs, but never being able to accumulate generational wealth to pass down.
But he doesn't blame laziness or poor budgeting. He blames systemic economic traps engineered by this specific spirit.
He lists them out very practically. Payday loan shops strategically placed in low-income neighborhoods charging 400% interest.
Rent-to-own stores selling basic furniture at triple the retail price.
And historically, banks utilizing redlining to systematically deny mortgage loans, thereby enforcing perpetual renting and preventing the accumulation of equity.
And he provides the specific spiritual motive behind these economic traps. The goal of the spirit of poverty isn't just to make people broke.
No, the goal is to keep the community so incredibly stressed, so exhausted by the daily grinding panic of sheer survival, that they literally have no mental or emotional energy left to focus on their spiritual destiny or discover their true identity.
Fourth is the spirit of death.
The text points to the glaring, statistically undeniable health disparities, significantly shorter lifespans, higher rates of maternal mortality, heart disease, diabetes, and hypertension.
But the author also points to active systemic violence, high homicide rates, police killings, and what he calls environmental racism.
Like poisoned municipal water systems and food deserts.
He specifically cites the horror of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment to prove his point.
For listeners unfamiliar, this was a study where the U.S. government deliberately withheld treatment from Black men infected with syphilis for 40 years, simply so they could study the long-term progression of the disease.
Point Blank calls this sanctioned murder and presents it as undeniable evidence that a literal spirit of death has been assigned to cut these lives short before they can ever fulfill their prophetic purpose.
Finally, the fifth principality is the spirit of confusion.
This spirit attacks identity at its most fundamental psychological levels, including gender identity and family roles.
The text frames modern cultural shifts and attacks on traditional gender roles not as cultural evolution or progressive freedom, but as a deliberate spiritual tactic to blur divine purpose.
The argument is that if the enemy can confuse your baseline identity and your specific role within the family structure, he can completely destabilize the foundation of the entire community.
Preventing the unified front that is absolutely required for effective spiritual warfare.
I look at this entire 5-spirit framework and I compare it to a spiritual MRI.
I like that analogy.
We look at society with our naked eyes and we see the surface symptoms: redlining, mass incarceration, health disparities, broken homes.
But Point Blank takes these known sociological symptoms, puts the community through this spiritual MRI machine, and diagnoses a deeply rooted ancient spiritual disease functioning beneath them.
By treating the disease rather than just the symptoms, he fundamentally elevates the civil rights struggle.
It is no longer just a political fight for legislative equality. It is a cosmic, apocalyptic battle against unseen forces.
You aren't ultimately fighting the police officer or the bank manager, the puppet. You are fighting the principality pulling the strings.
But this raises the biggest question of the entire text.
Right. If these demonic spirits, these principalities, have had a 400-year head start, if they have successfully built these massive interconnected systemic fortresses, what does the text say is the catalyst that finally stops them?
How do you actually break a 400-year curse?
That brings us to the climax of the author's argument.
The text argues that the catalyst is time itself, specifically a very rigid, biblically mandated prophetic timeline with a hard expiration date.
Point blank takes us all the way back to the book of Genesis, chapter 15, verse 13.
God is speaking to the patriarch Abraham in a vision and tells him that his seed, his descendants, will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs.
That they will serve them and that they will be deeply afflicted for exactly 400 years.
God also promises that afterward, he will judge the nation that oppresses them.
The author performs a very straightforward, historically grounded calculation here. He asks the listener, when did the very first documented slave ships arrive in the English colonies in North America?
The historical consensus is the year 1619, arriving at Point Comfort in Virginia.
So you take the year 1619 and you add the 400 years of profound affliction prophesied in Genesis 15.
That brings you exactly to the year 2019.
The text declares with absolute certainty that the 400-year sentence has officially expired.
We are now past the era of the curse and have officially entered the judgment phase.
And the author points to the current state of the world as undeniable evidence that this shift has occurred.
He cites the massive economic instability, the unprecedented political chaos, and the racial tension that exploded globally.
Specifically referencing the events of 2020, the massive worldwide protests following the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery.
He sees the tearing down of Confederate monuments and the sudden mainstream congressional discussions of reparations not as random, isolated political events, but as the literal prophetic shaking of the oppressing nation.
He also points to the broader decline of European colonial powers, noting how they're currently dealing with massive immigration crises and a loss of global economic dominance.
Arguing they are essentially being forced to eat the bitter fruit of the trauma they planted in Africa centuries ago.
So if the oppressors are entering their phase of divine judgment, what is happening to the oppressed?
The text outlines three major signs of what it calls the awakening occurring right now in the present day.
The first sign is DNA.
We touched on this briefly earlier, but the text emphasizes that for the first time in human history, the exact technology exists to trace genetic lineage back thousands of years,
bypassing the burned paper records.
The author points specifically to the Lemba tribe of Zimbabwe and South Africa.
Yes, the text states they have been scientifically tested by geneticists. For listeners who aren't geneticists, what exactly did they find?
They found that a significant portion of the Lemba men carry the Cohen modal haplotype.
What's a haplotype?
A haplotype is essentially a specific genetic signature, a set of DNA variations that is inherited together. This specific marker is found on the Y chromosome, passed directly from fathers to sons.
And it is highly concentrated in the Jewish priestly line descending from Aaron.
The Lemba oral tradition always claimed they were Jews who migrated from the north, and suddenly modern DNA proved it.
The text also reiterates the cultural and oral traditions of the Igbo people of Nigeria, linking them to ancient Hebrew customs.
The author views this DNA technology as a direct divine tool, revealing what the gatekeepers tried to hide.
The second sign of the awakening is technology itself, specifically the rise of the internet and social media.
Point Blank quotes the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 4, which prophesies that at the time of the end, knowledge shall be increased.
For centuries, the gatekeepers had an absolute monopoly on the flow of information. If you wanted to reach the masses, you needed a massive publishing house, a television network, or a seminary degree.
But the text argues that smartphones and platforms like YouTube and TikTok have completely shattered that monopoly.
The truth is spreading virally, peer-to-peer, fulfilling the prophecy of Daniel in real time, bypassing the academic and religious gatekeepers entirely.
The third sign is a profound spiritual hunger.
The text observes a deep restlessness in the community. Young people are leaving traditional slaveholder Christianity in droves because they are tired of the prosperity gospel and the theology of pacification.
They are asking incredibly hard structural questions. They want a theology of systemic justice, not just a promise of a mansion in heaven.
To fuel the spiritual awakening, the author insists on actively decoding the symbols that the enemy has perverted over the centuries.
He argues that Satan has no original creative power. He only steals and perverts what God created. So the text commands the listener to reclaim these symbols.
Take the color black, for instance. Point Blank argues that associating black solely with evil terms like black magic, black-hearted blackmail is a satanic linguistic perversion.
In ancient Hebrew culture, the author states, black represents holy mystery and incredible depth. The Holy of Holies in the ancient temple was pitch dark.
It represents the rich, fertile, life-giving soil.
The text also reclaims purple, the biblical color of royalty and the priesthood.
He reminds the listeners that despite their current socioeconomic status, they are a literal kingdom of priests who are currently just wearing the rags of poverty.
And he reclaims animal symbols. The eagle, representing divine vision and elevation above worldly circumstances, refusing to be trapped pecking on the ground like a chicken.
And crucially, the Lion of Judah. The author stresses that lions are apex predators, not prey.
He tells the listener that they have been hunted and treated like prey for 400 years, but it's time to wake up and realize they are actually the lion.
But perhaps the most profound psychological unwinding the text attempts involves the deeply personal issue of names.
The author points out that the Irish, the Italians, the Chinese, most immigrant groups in the Americas still carry their ancestral names.
But Black people in the Americas carry names like Johnson, Smith, or Williams.
If you're listening to this, think about the name on your driver's license. Point Blank calls these names brands.
He calls them 400-year-old receipts of ownership.
He argues that in the spirit realm, names carry incredible authority and identity. By stripping the enslaved ancestors of their tribal Hebrew names and forcing them to adopt the surnames of their European slave masters, the gatekeepers executed a devastating spiritual, legal maneuver.
They anchored the people permanently to their trauma and completely severed their linguistic connection to their divine inheritance.
This leads to the author's vital theological distinction between two ancient Greek words used for time, chronos and kairos.
Chronos is just chronological time, the ticking of the stopwatch, the calendar pages turning day by day.
But kairos is fundamentally different. Kairos is the appointed time, the opportune, highly specific window of divine intervention.
So Chronos is like a stopwatch running endlessly in the background, but Kairos is like catching a wave and surfing. You can sit out there in the water for hours. That's Chronos. But the Kairos is that exact 3-second window where the wave swells perfectly beneath you, and you either stand up and ride it, or you get crushed by it.
That's a brilliant way to explain it. Point Blank is declaring that right now, this very moment in history is a Kairos moment.
The 400 years of Chronos time have officially run out, triggering this tiny critical Kairos window for global Black unity, awakening, and restoration.
But he also issues an incredibly stark warning to his audience. Because it is a Kairos moment, the enemy is furious.
The spiritual principality knows its time is short. The text predicts coming global economic collapse and increased targeted persecution, specifically for those spreading this Israelite teaching.
He urges his listeners to put on the armor of God mentioned in Ephesians, commanding them to move past simple social media activism and engage in serious, dedicated spiritual preparation.
I am continually struck by the profound tectonic psychological shift this text demands from its audience.
It really is huge.
It is asking them to completely discard a foundational narrative of being the descendants of slaves and instead adopt the royal identity of descendants of kings who were temporarily enslaved.
It is a total inversion of the psychological power dynamic. Think about how radically that changes a person's posture as they walk through the world.
As Point Blank says, you move from politely begging a corrupt system for basic equality to standing up tall and demanding your rightful divine inheritance.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this massive sweeping argument. We have covered incredible ground today.
We really have. We've seen how the 400-year sentence attempts to seamlessly merge ancient biblical geography, the horrific, bloody historical realities of the transatlantic slave trade, and modern sociological disparities like redlining and mass incarceration into one single, cohesive, inescapable narrative.
It is a narrative of a divine covenant that was originally established in ancient Africa, broken through disobedience, punished through 400 years of globally coordinated, spiritually engineered captivity.
And which is now, according to Reverend Point Blank, finally reaching its prophesied expiration and ultimate restoration.
The text concludes with a fierce, urgent call to action.
He also demands that the listeners stop being passive consumers of content. He tells them to type the phrase, "I am awake," in the comment section, to intentionally signal the algorithm and force the message past the digital gatekeepers.
He demands they share the video, warning their families, and refusing to ever let themselves be lulled back to sleep by the culture.
And he seals this intense message with a poetic conclusion he calls the Great Inversion.
The poem speaks powerfully of the silence of the established churches during the slave trade, describing how they baptized chains in the name of the free.
But it vows that the truth is a fire that never slows, and that the byword is finally breaking, the yoke of iron is shattered, and the Lion of Judah is finally awake.
It is an absolutely staggering piece of rhetoric.
It is. And as we leave you today, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own.
Regardless of your own religious background, regardless of your personal geopolitical views or your stance on the specific theology we discussed today, I want you to think about the incredible world-shaping power of narrative.
What happens to a society, what happens to an entire community when they completely reframe their historical trauma?
When they collectively decide that their darkest, most brutal centuries were not a sign of random, chaotic cruelty, and certainly not a sign of inherent genetic weakness, but rather the intense, biblically prophesied trial of a chosen people.
A trial that the ticking clock of history has just run out on.
Remember that vault we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive?
The one guarded by $1 billion fortress and heavily armed gatekeepers.
How does a world built on the old, comfortable narrative respond when the slumbering giant inside that vault finally decides to wake up, look at the guards, and realize the vault actually belongs to them?
Let's get it! That's the deep dive session lesson for the ages. We rewrote the narrative, turned history's pages. From the west side blocks where we learned to stand up tall. Send a message to the world, peace and love for y'all. Reverend Point Blank signed off. The truth is in the air. Take this energy with you. Peace and love everywhere.